Anyway, we'll leave it right there. Greg, be careful. I'm Dennis Bernstein. Here comes the news.
KPFA, KPFB Berkeley, 88.1, KFCF in Fresno.
Good evening. It's Tuesday, September 22nd. The deal is all but done. Republicans now have the votes to proceed with President Trump's nominee to replace the late Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and they're going to do it in near record time before the November 3rd presidential election. Democrats' hopes for a delay are crushed today when Senators Romney and Gardner announce they'll go along with the party plan. As Republicans move to the brink of achieving a right-wing majority on the nation's highest court, your health care insurance and the right to choose an abortion are in peril. As the nation records its 200,000th death from the coronavirus, the worst in the world, the White House says, it could have been worse. President Trump takes to the world stage to blame China.
We have waged a fierce battle against the invisible enemy, the China virus, which has claimed countless lives in 188 countries. We must hold accountable the nation which unleashed this plague onto the world.
And more of California cleared to reopen additional businesses today, including most of the San Francisco Bay Area and one of Southern California's largest counties, as coronavirus infection rates in the state fall to their lowest level of the pandemic. From Pacifica Radio, KPFA Berkeley, KPFK Los Angeles, this is the Evening News. I'm Mark Miracle. Republican Senate Judiciary Committee Chair Lindsey Graham declared today that Republicans have the votes to confirm President Donald Trump's Supreme Court pick before the November 3rd election.
We've got the votes to confirm Justice Ginsburg's replacement before the election. We're going to move forward in the committee. We're going to report the nomination out of the committee to the floor of the United States Senate so we can vote before the election.
Graham's statement came as Colorado Republican Senator Cory Gardner said he would vote to confirm a qualified nominee put forward by President Trump. Democrats had hoped Gardner would join Maine Senator Susan Collins and Alaska's Lisa Murkowski, who said a final decision on Ginsburg's replacement should be made by the president elected on November 3rd. That hope wasn't realized, and neither was there hope in Republican Senator Mitt Romney of Utah.
So I recognize that we may have a court which has more of a conservative bent than it's had over the last few decades. But my liberal friends have, over many decades, gotten very used to the idea of having a liberal court. And that's not written in the stars. And I know that a lot of people are saying, gosh, we don't want that change. I understand the energy associated with that perspective. But it's also appropriate for a nation which is, if you will, center-right, to have a court which reflects center-right points of view.
Democrats had needed 4 Republicans to vote against moving forward with a Trump nominee. The votes now in hand, Senate Republicans are charging ahead with plans to confirm Trump's pick to fill the late Justice Ginsburg Supreme Court seat before the November 3rd election. It would be one of the quickest confirmation efforts in recent times. No court nominee in U.S. history has been considered so close to a presidential election. And it all comes as the nation is marking the grave milestone of 200,000 deaths from the coronavirus pandemic. During a private lunch meeting today at Senate Republican campaign headquarters, several Republican senators spoke up in favor of voting before the election, and none advocated a delay. Elsewhere, as tributes poured in for Ginsburg with vigils and flowers at the Supreme Court steps, Democrats, led by presidential nominee Joe Biden, vowed a tough fight. Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer said that we should honor Ginsburg's dying wish, which was that her seat not be filled until the man who wins the presidential elections is installed in January.
Leader McConnell, sadly, is headed down the path of breaking his word to the Senate and the American people. He has exposed once and for all that a supposed principle of giving the people a voice in selecting the next justice was a farce. Sadly, Leader McConnell has defiled the Senate like no one in this generation. And Leader McConnell may very well destroy it.
But a delay no longer seems an option. 2 Republicans said they would oppose taking up a nomination at this time, but no others are in sight. Under Senate rules, Vice President Mike Pence could break a tie vote if necessary. Few Republicans are willing to cross Trump. Trump has criticized Republican Senators Susan Collins of Maine and Lisa Murkowski of Alaska for opposing a Senate vote before elections. Trump warned that they would be very badly hurt by voters in November. Senator Collins went further today, saying she would vote against Trump's pick, no matter who it was, because, quote, I might not support that nominee under normal circumstances, but we're simply too close to the election. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell made no scheduling announcements, but according to a Republican aide granted anonymity to discuss deliberations, hearings could start as soon as October 12th by the Senate Judiciary Committee, with a vote in the full Senate by October 29th. After Trump met with conservative Judge Amy Coney Barrett at the White House yesterday, he told reporters he would interview other candidates and might meet with Judge Barbara Lagoa when he travels to Florida later this week. Conversations in the White House and McConnell's office have been increasingly focused on Barrett and Lagoa. Barrett, who's 48, a judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit, has long been favored by conservatives. Those familiar with the process said interest inside the White House seemed to be waning for Lagoa amid concerns she did not have a proven record as a conservative journalist. Lagoa has been pushed by Florida's governor, and aides tout her political advantages of being Hispanic and hailing from the key political battleground state of Florida. Trump is saying he will reveal his nominee this Saturday at 5 o'clock. The loss of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the possibility of another Trump appointment to the Supreme Court have set off alarm bells among health care activists because the Supreme Court is scheduled to hold a hearing in a case that could lead to the overturn of Obamacare. Christopher Martinez reports.
Many Supreme Court watchers see the vacancy created by the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg as an opportunity for Republicans to turn the High Court farther to the right, perhaps for a generation. But some also see a much closer issue, the possibility of the court overturning Obamacare in the midst of a deadly pandemic. Laura Packard is a stage 4 cancer survivor and co-chair of the group Healthcare Vote.
If reelected, Trump and these Republican senators will try to repeal the Affordable Care Act again, but they might not even have to if they can ram through a Supreme Court candidate to tip the ballots.
Packard joined others on a press call about the Supreme Court vacancy and its effect on access to health care. On November 10th, a week after the presidential election, the Supreme Court is scheduled to take up a case that could end up repealing the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. That puts even more importance on the High Court nomination, as well as on the presidential and Senate elections.
Yes, it's a healthcare election. It is now a healthcare election on steroids.
Brad Woodhouse is director of the group Protect Our Care.
The reason they are rushing a justice to get on the Supreme Court before the election is because on November 10th, the United States Supreme Court is taking up a case that most neutral and certainly, more progressive legal scholars think is bunk on the legal theory, but is the case they are counting on to rip away the Affordable Care Act and to rip away everything that the Affordable Care Act entails. All the protections, all the coverage, all of the things.
He says with another conservative vote on the High Court, Obamacare would be in greater danger at a most inopportune time. More than 12 million Americans have already lost employer-based health insurance because of COVID-related job losses. Healthcare advocates are also concerned about the loss of pre-existing conditions protections if the Trump administration and 18 red states win their lawsuit against the ACA. Senator Chris Murphy is a Democrat from Connecticut.
That case calls for the entirety of the Affordable Care Act to be invalidated, which means likely overnight 25 million people losing their health care, 135 million Americans having their rates go up because they have pre-existing conditions, 2.5 million adult children being kicked off their parents' insurance. The consequences are absolutely catastrophic for American families if a right-wing justice gets appointed to this court.
Trump and Republican senators have been consistent in wanting to overturn Obamacare. In the current election, many Republicans see the issue of Obamacare as a strength in terms of activating Republican voters, and likewise for a Supreme Court vacancy. But Democrats are also seeing a winning issue. In the days after Ginsburg's death, Democratic Senate campaigns in 10 close races surged. Senator Murphy sees hope in the lessons of history. In this case, he's looking at lessons from earlier in the Trump administration.
Remember, a lot of political pundits said that there was nothing we could do to stop the repeal of the ACA in 2017. Well, ultimately, there was a national uprising in which people made clear that there would be political consequences for Republicans who supported the elimination of their health care, and ultimately the ACA survived. I think we have the ability to muster that same kind of political uprising over the course of the next several weeks.
Meanwhile, activists like Packard of Healthcare Vote are taking action in their home states, and they're encouraging others to get involved.
We've lived through years of scary uncertainty and now months of sheltering in place. Enough is enough. We are all healthcare voters now, and we'll see if our wavering senators are healthcare voters too.
Reporting for Pacifica Radio News KPFA, I'm Christopher Martinez.
The latest effort by Texas and 17 allied states to strike down the 10-year-old Affordable Care Act was considered a long shot at the court because of Chief Justice John Roberts' alignment with the four liberal judges in prior challenges. But without Ginsburg, there could be 4 votes on either side, which would leave a federal appeals court ruling against the law intact. If Trump and Senate Republicans nominate and confirm a conservative successor to hear the case, that could tip the balance. But not so fast. Erwin Chermaninsky, dean of the Berkeley School of Law, says the demise of Obamacare may not be so swift.
The case is California versus Texas. And in 2012, the Supreme Court 5-4 upheld the Affordable Care Act. The key issue there was whether the individual mandate is constitutional. This is the provision that said that everyone had to either purchase insurance by 2016 or pay a tax penalty. The Supreme Court decision was 5-4, with Roberts joining together with Ginsburg, Brierson, and Kagan. In December 2017, as part of the tax reform bill, Congress eliminated the penalty for not purchasing insurance. The Fifth Circuit said the individual mandate is the key to the Affordable Care Act. Congress is essentially taken out the individual mandate. Doesn't that make the whole act unconstitutional? I have to tell you, I think that's a frivolous argument. If a court declares unconstitutional a part of a statute, the question is, would the legislature have adopted the rest of the statute without it? Here it's not the court having declared unconstitutional part of the statute. It's Congress simply negating a part of the law. There's no doubt that Congress wanted the rest of the law. In fact, in the same month, Congress refused to eliminate the Affordable Care Act. Also, it's hard for me to believe that the justices want to eliminate the Affordable Care Act that provides health insurance for 25 million people in the midst of a pandemic.
Hard to believe, perhaps, but that so-called frivolous argument convinced enough justices on the Fifth Circuit to make it all the way to the Supreme Court, and to make it to the Supreme Court as the decision that'll stand if the Supreme Court can't find 5 justices to overturn it. What would happen, say, if the Supreme Court ties, if John Roberts plays institutionalist, doesn't want to upset the apple cart, but the conservative justices hold firm against the Affordable Care Act?
Well, then the Fifth Circuit decision is affirmed by an evenly divided court. Then the Fifth Circuit said it should go back to the district court to decide whether this means the whole Affordable Care Act is unconstitutional. So it wouldn't immediately end the Affordable Care Act, but it would send it back. My guess is if the justices are tied 4-4, they would put over the case and have it re-argued when there was a 9th justice. A couple of years ago, when Brett Kavanaugh hadn't been on the court for the October 2018 session, they simply took 2 cases where they were split 4-4 and had them re-argued in January when Kavanaugh was there. Given the likelihood that President Trump's going to get somebody through, I think the justice, rather than split 4-4, would just wait until there's a 9th justice.
Erwin Chermaninsky of the Berkeley School of Law speaking with Brian Edwards Tickert of KPFA's Up Front show. And this is the evening news on KPFA Berkeley, KPFK Los Angeles, KFCF Fresno, online at kpfa.org. In Colorado, pro-choice organizers are increasing their efforts now to protect what they call the legacy of the late Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a staunch defender of gender equality and reproductive rights. Lily Bolke reports.
Centennial state voters will decide in November whether to implement Proposition 115, a ban on abortions after 22 weeks, and a criminal penalty for doctors who perform them. The jurists reported to be on President Donald Trump's shortlist for a Supreme Court nominee are largely anti-abortion. Stephanie Clark with no on Prop 115 says that makes fighting at the state level all the more important.
I don't think you can overstate what the loss of Justice Ginsburg means to women, to the reproductive rights movement, and to our nation. And the fact is she was one of the strongest remaining defenders of safe and legal abortion on the Supreme Court. So if you thought the stakes couldn't get any higher in this election, they just did.
Proponents of Prop 115 say abortions past 22 weeks are morally wrong and that it's enough time to find out if a pregnancy poses any health or emotional risk. But research shows the most common reason for delaying an abortion is transportation and procedure costs, and this restriction would disproportionately affect young women and women in poverty who don't recognize their pregnancies early. Clark says Colorado voters have rejected similar measures 3 times in the last 12 years, and just 1% of abortions occur later in pregnancy.
We trust women and families to make these personal medical decisions in consultation with their doctors and without interference from politicians. So if there ever was time to double down and stop this dangerous and deceptive abortion ban in its tracks, now is the time.
She says her campaign has a lot of work to do because it's crucial that voters get accurate information in order to make a decision on Proposition 115. For Public News Service, I'm Lily Bolke.
Prior to today's rush to judgment, 10 former federal judges, including former FBI Director William Webster, asked Senate leaders to withhold consideration of a Supreme Court nominee until after Inauguration Day. The ex-judges, appointed by both Democratic and Republican presidents, said the judicial confirmation process has become dangerously politicized. They warned that injecting a bitter Supreme Court confirmation fight into the noxious mix could unalterably change and diminish the public's faith in the vital institution of the Supreme Court. The legitimacy of the Supreme Court, they wrote, is not something that can be recovered if it is lost. Judges wrote in the letter to Senate leaders from both parties, it is up to you to demonstrate the same restraint demanded of our judiciary. The United States today surpassed 200,000 deaths from the coronavirus pandemic, according to Johns Hopkins University, just 8 months after the first positive case was identified in a Washington traveler on January 21st. Since the pandemic reached global attention in early March, COVID-19 has wreaked havoc across the country, sickening millions and leaving countless patients hospitalized with life-threatening complications. The United States leads the world in coronavirus deaths and still has the most cases in the world, with over 6.8 million people sickened by the virus since January. Worldwide, there are over 31 million cases, over 966,000 deaths. Because pre-existing conditions factor so heavily into virus outcomes, the data continues to show that COVID-19 disproportionately affects poor communities of color. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the majority of COVID-19 deaths during the early months of the pandemic occurred in communities with lower incomes and denser populations of people of color. And another potential surge of cases poses the greatest dangers for low-income communities and essential workers such as nurses, restaurant servers, teachers, and more. The real number of dead is thought to be much higher, in part because many COVID-19 deaths, especially early on, were ascribed to other causes. The number of dead in the U.S. is equivalent to a September 11th attack every day for 67 days. Is roughly equal to the population of Salt Lake City, Huntsville, Alabama, or Glendale or Huntington Beach in California. The weekly number of new COVID-19 cases was up last week after falling for 8 straight weeks. Health experts blame the rise on special gatherings over Labor Day weekend and schools reopening. The number of new cases is on the rise in 28 states. Speaking on CNN, infectious disease specialist Anthony Fauci warned that cases may spike as the temperatures cool and people move indoors.
We're getting into a weather season where people will be spending more time indoors. And depending upon your own social situation, indoors for you or another person may mean poor ventilation, poor airflow, and difficulty getting the kind of removal of anything that would lead to spread. You know, you talk about particles, you talk about air, singing, coughing, sneezing, all those types of things. Those are the things that I get concerned about as we get into October and November and December. I'd like to see us go into that at such a low level that when you have the inevitable cases, you can handle them. When they get out of hand, then I worry.
In a recorded speech to the United Nations, President Trump says his administration has done an incredible job in responding to the pandemic, adding, "The only thing we've done a bad job in is public relations because we haven't been able to convince people," which is basically the fake news. What a great job we've done. At an Ohio rally last night, Trump falsely claimed that only old people with pre-existing conditions need fear getting sick from the coronavirus.
Now we know it affects elderly people with heart problems and other problems. If they have other problems, that's what it really affects. That's it. You know, in some states, thousands of people, nobody young, below the age of 18, like nobody. They have a strong immune system. Who knows? You take your hat off to the young because they have a hell of an immune system. But it affects virtually nobody. It's an amazing thing. By the way, open your schools. Everybody open your schools.
Starting in the summer, younger people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s have been accounting for a rising share of coronavirus cases. At the White House, meanwhile, Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany said Americans should not dwell on the 200,000 dead, but look at the bright side of those who could have died instead.
We were looking at the prospect of 2 million people potentially perishing from the coronavirus in this country. We grieve when even one life is lost. But the fact that we have come nowhere near that number is a testament to this president taking immediate action.
And speaking in that pre-recorded speech at the United Nations, Trump tried to shift the blame to China. Sarah Walton reports.
He accused China of lying about the seriousness of the pandemic when it first broke out and criticized the UN's own health body, the WHO.
The World Health Organization which is virtually controlled by China, falsely declared that there was no evidence of human-to-human transmission. The United Nations must hold China accountable for their actions.
China's ambassador to the UN, Zhang Jun, responded by saying that his country strongly rejected the baseless accusations made by the US leader. I'm Sarah Walton in New York.
California's top health officials said today the state is loosening restrictions on 9 counties and allowing nail salons to reopen indoors statewide, with some modifications as coronavirus infection rates continue to slow. Alameda, Riverside, San Luis Obispo, San Mateo, and Solano counties shifted from the toughest restrictions, known as widespread, or purple to red. That means barbershops, hair salons, restaurants, museums, aquariums, and zoos can operate indoors at 25% capacity. Retail shops at half capacity, subject to county regulations, which can be tougher, although not looser. California Health and Human Services Secretary Dr. Mark Galley warns that slowly lifting restrictions is not a free-for-all.
Good news all around, but really a reminder that we, despite seeing this steady downward trajectory, that we cannot drop our guard. People ask me on an ongoing basis, why the slow and stringent approach? And I'll remind you, we want to be slow and stringent so as we move forward, we can be best prepared in case we see some increase in transmission, that it doesn't cause us to take one giant step backward.
As the fall season begins, flu season approaches. Public health experts have expressed concern over a perfect storm of accelerated COVID activity and an active flu season that could stretch hospital capacity this winter. A second wave of coronavirus is already hitting parts of the U.S. and beyond. Dr. Galley says the goal is to stop that from happening in California.
We are seeing across the nation an increase in a number of states. We're seeing a second wave starting in Europe. Some European countries are returning back to stricter stay-at-home-like orders, some additional restrictions that, of course, we've seen here in California. We were the first state to implement that statewide stay-at-home order, but we are doing all that we can to make sure our counties can avoid a step back in that way to a more restrictive level of operation.
Galley says the same measures that mitigate the spread of the coronavirus, such as physical distancing, masking, and hand hygiene, are also effective at keeping the flu at bay. So if those measures are taken seriously, a worst-case scenario winter season can be avoided. Meanwhile, infection rates continue to increase, albeit slowly, 0.3% in the last 24 hours. Deaths increased 0.4%. California now has more than 784,000 reported infections, more than 15,000 reported coronavirus fatalities. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson appealed today for resolve and a spirit of togetherness through the winter as he unveiled new restrictions on everyday life to suppress a dramatic spike in coronavirus cases. Warning that the measures could last for 6 months, Johnson voiced hope that things will be far better by the spring, when a vaccine and mass testing could be in place. The most high-profile change centered on pubs, restaurants, and other entertainment venues in England, which starting tomorrow must close at 10 p.m. In a change of emphasis, the Prime Minister urged people to work from home when possible. He said stiff fines will be imposed on anyone breaking quarantine rules or gathering in groups of more than 6. While the use of face masks will be expanded to include passengers in taxis and staff at bars and shops. He said further restrictions might have to be introduced if people fail to abide by the rules.
This is a great and freedom-loving country, and while the vast majority have complied with the rules, there have been too many breaches, too many opportunities for our invisible enemy to slip through undetected. The virus has started to spread again in an exponential way.
The other nations of the UK, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, also tightened restrictions, going further in some cases. The new curbs come as the UK recorded 4,926 new confirmed coronavirus cases, the highest daily total since early May and 4 times the figure of a month ago. Many scientists see echoes of the path of the outbreak earlier in the year, when the virus spread swiftly through the country and led to Europe's deadliest outbreak. The UK has seen 41,825 people die within 28 days of testing positive for COVID-19. Johnson had told lawmakers in the House of Commons that, barring a vaccine or new forms of mass testing, the country should assume that the restrictions he's announcing will remain in place for perhaps 6 months. An air bridge between the United States and the UK is under discussion as a possible means for travelers to sidestep quarantine rules amid the coronavirus pandemic. Simon Marks has that story.
A new report suggests that the near impossibility of travel now between the United States and the United Kingdom is costing the British economy more than $40 million a day. There are only a handful of non-stop flights to London currently operating from the main hubs on the east and west coast of the United States after COVID-19 brought transatlantic travel to its knees. The research was commissioned by a conglomerate of aviation groups, including Heathrow Airport. Its chief executive, John Holland Kay, is renewing his call for an air bridge to be created between the two countries, with passengers being tested at airports before departure and upon arrival.
I can't overestimate the importance of the United States to us as a country. If we're not able to travel to the United States, we're not able to get our economy up and running again. So this is really critical for the UK. And what we want to see as a start is an air bridge with New York. We could get it up and running within a few weeks if the government in the UK and the US get a move on with this. That would allow us to save thousands of jobs within the UK, but also show that we are genuinely an outward-looking trading nation as we leave the EU.
More than 30 countries have introduced airport-based testing, including Charles de Gaulle in Paris and Dubai. And the new research is designed to put pressure on political leaders on both sides of the Atlantic to strike some kind of a deal. Simon Marks, Washington.
Hundreds of millions of dollars intended to help respond to the coronavirus pandemic has been funneled to the Pentagon and its private defense contractors. That's according to a new report from the Washington Post newspaper. The money has gone to projects including drone technology, Army uniform material, body armor, and jet engine parts. Department of Defense head Mark Esper, a former Raytheon lobbyist, began to redefine who could receive some $1 billion in coronavirus response aid weeks after Congress approved it back in March. You're listening to the Evening News on KPFA Berkeley, KPFK Los Angeles, KFCF Fresno, online at kpfa.org. It's an hour-long newscast. It airs each night at 6 o'clock. There's a half-hour edition on the weekend. And it's archived online at kpfa.org. I'm Mark Miracle, and this is day number 1 of the Fall Fund Drive here at KPFA. We have a goal of raising $450,000 to keep this radio station on the air through the coming weeks, through the debate over President Trump's nominee to the Supreme Court to replace Ruth Bader Ginsburg, through the election. And the election is not going to be merely confined to November 3rd. Through the ordeal that will follow the election, up into the new year, and maybe then we're done with it, although I would not lay money on that. At any rate, multiple crises that face this country, and we are doing our best. Believe me, it is hard, and I don't think that we're living up to all the challenges. Multiple crises in this country, of course, the pandemic, the health crisis, its accompanying economic crisis, which of course has not just caused the layoffs of tens of millions of Americans, but revealed the underlying economic weakness of inequality in this country, inequality of income, inequality of power and say. And of course, an election which may be free and fair, may not be. $450,000 is the amount of money that we need to stay on the air to continue this coverage. And if that's important to you, we're asking for your financial support to do that, because basically there's no one else. 90% of our funding comes from you, our listeners. There is no commercial advertising. You probably know that. You've noticed that. There's also no commercial advertising light, which is called corporate underwriting, which has been embraced by most public radio stations. There's no corporate underwriting here. There's no commercial advertising. There's no direct corporate money or indirect corporate money. There's no rich people in the wings. There's no big foundation funding us. No think tank sending us money. Basically, we rely on you, our listeners. That's the way it's been since our founding in 1949. And it's always a very fraught enterprise when we open these microphones, stop all our programming, stop the music, stop the news, bring in the dough. And whether or not we can accomplish it is always up in the air, and really up to you. 1-800-439-5732. Tonight, I am looking for 20 of you to make a financial donation to become what we used to call a subscriber here, a KPFA donor, a listener supporter, a listener sponsor. Whatever appellation you would like, you can have it. If we can have some of your financial resources to keep this unique experimental radio station, alternative source of news and information and music on the air. 1-800-439-5732. I'm looking for 20 of you by the end of this newscast in 23 minutes. 1-800-439-5732 here on day number 1 of the fund drive. KPFA.org. You can do it online, or you can give us a call at 1-800-439-5732 or online at kpfa.org. 1-800-439-5732, kpfa.org. We never have enough time during this hour-long newscast to cover everything that I personally think is worthy of coverage. And when we have to take time out to do fundraising, I especially feel that lack. So I'm going to return to the news now. Hope you've got the message. Hope you will respond. Be part of the mighty 20, the terrific 20. Oh, God, that sounds awful. 1-800-439-5732 or kpfa.org. Cindy McCain endorsed Democrat Joe Biden for president today in a rebuke of President Trump by the widow of the Republicans' 2008 nominee for president. Trump has had a fraught relationship with members of John McCain's family since he disparaged the Arizona senator during his 2016 campaign. But the McCains have until now stopped short of endorsing Trump's rivals. Cindy McCain cited the decades-long friendship between her family and Biden's and their bond as the parents of children serving in the military. Cindy McCain's backing could help Biden appeal to Republicans disaffected with the Republican president and give the former vice president a boost in Arizona. That's a crucial swing state. The McCain represented in Congress for 35 years. Today is National Voter Registration Day, and good government groups say it's more important than ever to be registered. Suzanne Potter reports.
Millions of citizens have not yet registered. So Jonathan Mettes-Stein with Common Cause is working to spread the word. Every vote counts.
For a lot of low propensity voters, limited English-speaking voters, young voters, and first-time voters, they don't even realize that voter registration is that first step to voting. And so National Voter Registration Day is an opportunity to draw everyone's attention to the need to register to vote.
It only takes a few minutes to register at registertovote.ca.gov, or you can just register and vote on the same day at any polling place or vote center in the state. This year, California became the first state to send mail-in ballots and not just ballot request forms to every registered voter so people can vote from home without worrying about being exposed to COVID-19. Mettes-Stein says voters need to follow the directions on the ballot carefully.
Hundreds of thousands of voters have problems with their vote by mail ballot every single election cycle because they failed to sign the ballot envelope, or the signature on their ballot envelope doesn't match the signature that's on file, or they simply turn it in too late.
President Donald Trump has railed against sending ballots to all registered voters, claiming it raises the risk of voter fraud. However, in the 5 states that do so, actual cases of fraud have been infinitesimal. All ballots are tracked with barcodes and go through extensive verification with signature matching technology. Mettes-Stein notes there has been no partisan advantage to vote by mail in past elections.
Study after study has shown that if you increase access to vote by mail, it benefits voters by expanding access to the ballot, but it does not have a benefit for Democrats or Republicans.
In-person voting locations will vary by county, so it's important to check your county registrar of voters website. 15 of the state's counties, including LA and Orange counties, have switched to a system of regional vote centers that are larger and open before the election. The other counties retain the traditional neighborhood polling places that are open on Election Day only. Support for this reporting was provided by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. For Public News Service, I'm Suzanne Potter.
North Carolina election officials agreed today that mail-in absentee ballots returned this fall with deficient information can be fixed without forcing the voter to fill out a new blank ballot. The change, if it stands, would likely yield an upward tick in the number of counted ballots in this presidential battleground state. The State Board of Elections issued the new guidance to county boards explaining residents won't be forced to start over from scratch in casting votes if a witness fails to sign or provide an address on the envelope containing their absentee ballot. The guidance means that the ballot now won't be considered spoiled and that the voter will be sent an affidavit to sign to rectify the problem. Issues with deficient witness information on mail-in ballots have disproportionately affected African American voters. A day ahead of National Voter Registration Day, a federal judge ruled Nevada can move forward with its new vote-by-mail law. Roz Brown reports.
On Monday, a lawsuit filed by President Donald Trump's re-election campaign over Nevada's mail-in voting measure was dismissed. That means active voters would receive a mail-in ballot regardless of whether they request one. Chris Davin leads Equality Nevada in Henderson, an advocacy group for civil rights, particularly the LGBTQ community. He says the group encourages voters to choose pro-equality candidates, whether it's the White House, State House, or City Council.
We're seeing a very high amount of people that are coming in that are young. A lot of the X and the millenniums, they want to make sure that their voice is heard because they need change.
Trump blasted the state's new mail-in voting law at a re-election rally in Henderson earlier this month, saying it would be fraudulent. Nevada Governor Steve Sisolak responded to the judge's ruling Monday, saying the state law would expand options for Nevadans and provide for safe, fair, and accessible elections during the pandemic. Roughly 1/3 of all Nevada voters have said they plan to vote by mail. Davin does not believe potential fraud allegations are valid.
People get their tax returns, people get their stimulus checks, they get their driver's license. everything comes by mail, what is the concern of the election ballot coming by mail?
Nevadans who want to register to vote online must do so by October 29th, but the deadline for registering by mail is much earlier, October 6th, which is the same deadline for registering to vote in person. Nevada's early voting period begins Saturday, October 17th, and continues through October 30th, but dates and hours may vary based on the city where you live. Support for this reporting was provided by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. For Public News Service, I'm Roz Brown.
Billionaire Mike Bloomberg is helping some formerly incarcerated people in Florida pay their court-related debt so they can vote in the presidential election. The former Democratic presidential candidate is taking action days after Florida Governor Ron DeSantis won a court victory to prohibit the former prisoners from voting until they've also paid off their fines, court restitution, and court fees, which can run into the thousands of dollars. Bloomberg's part of an effort that's raised more than $20 million to help formerly incarcerated people regain their right to vote in the presidential election. That's in addition to the $100 million he's pledged to help Joe Biden win Florida. The issue has ping-ponged in the Florida courts after voters approved a measure restoring the right to vote to former prisoners. Florida's Republican lawmakers then said they couldn't vote until they paid off their fines. The plan to pay off their debts is aimed at former prisoners who registered to vote while the law was in question and who owe $1,500 or less. That accounts for about 31,000 people. If most of them vote for Biden, the margin could be critical in a year when the polls show Biden and Trump in a dead heat in Florida. Advocates and former prisoners have pointed to the unfairness of a system without a centralized registry so people can know precisely what their debts are. Groups are working with former prisoners to help them make that determination. You're listening to the Evening News on KPFA Berkeley, KPFK Los Angeles, KFCF Fresno, online at kpfa.org.
Hey everyone, this is Brian Edwards-Teekert.
And I'm Kat Brooks.
Weekday mornings we host Upfront.
2 hours of conversation about what's in the news and what should be.
Politics, technology.
Prisons, police.
What's happening in City Hall and at the State House.
In Washington and in the streets.
That's starting at 7 a.m., right after Democracy Now!
On Upfront.
And we're still seeking 20 of you who are listening to the Evening News tonight to make a financial pledge here on day number 1 of the Fall Fund Drive here at KPFA. The number to call is 1-800-439-5732 or online at kpfa.org. Why do you want to do that? Well, if you are listening to this radio station, let me tell you that nearly all of the money that it takes to run this radio station, be that paying the utility bill or paying the staff janitor or buying a new microphone or refurbishing a studio, that money comes from you. It doesn't come from anywhere else. It doesn't come from the government. Doesn't come from the private sector, doesn't come from philanthropy, except from the philanthropic nature of our listeners. It comes from people who want to hear what this radio station puts on the air, who says what it has to say, who plays the music that you want to hear. So if that's important to you, if this radio station is important to you, we have to ask for your financial support, which is what I'm doing right now. And I don't want all of you to go to your phone and dial 1-800-439-5732. Let's exercise some restraint, people. Just 20 of you. Please, order. Please, have some decorum. Stand in line. Don't push. Actually, rather than jam that phone booth, you can do it online at kpfa.org. 1-800-439-5732, kpfa.org. Looking for 20 of you tonight to support the Pacifica Evening News, the evening news here on KPFA. 1-800-439-5732 or kpfa.org. About a dozen anti-death penalty protesters marched from Congress to the United States Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. today to oppose the ramping up of federal executions taking place just weeks ahead of the November election. Attorney General William Barr is to receive an award during the National Catholic Prayer Breakfast tomorrow, which is the day between two federal executions, raising alarm from religious leaders who oppose capital punishment, including many Catholics, like the Attorney General. KPFA's Chris Lee reports.
The National Catholic Prayer Breakfast takes place virtually this year, and President Donald Trump was recently added to the list of speakers. Although Trump is not Catholic, Attorney General William Barr is and will receive an award for exemplifying the teachings of the Catholic Church. However, some faith leaders are raising alarm since the Catholic Church opposes capital punishment, but the Trump administration, led by Barr, has executed 5 people in recent months. Jason Miller is campaign director of Franciscan Action Network, a faith-based human rights organization in the United States.
Pope Francis recently updated the Catholic Catechism, so the official teaching of the Church, to say that the death penalty is inadmissible. So as Catholics, we should not be using it in any circumstance. Instead, Attorney General Barr is receiving an award from the National Catholic Prayer Breakfast tomorrow, and that's sandwiched in between 2 federal executions. So there's a federal execution today, he's receiving the award tomorrow, and then there's a federal execution the next day.
The event was rescheduled to September earlier this year due to the coronavirus pandemic. Miller says he and over 200 Catholic priests, sisters, theologians, and faith leaders across the country have signed on to a letter urging Barr not to accept the award. When Trump took office, almost a dozen prisoners on death row had exhausted their appeals, but it took over 3 years for Barr to approve recent executions, leading some worried that the award could be politically motivated. Abe Bonowitz, director of Death Penalty Action, accuses Trump of using the cruel practice to rile up his base ahead of the November election.
This is really scripted by the Donald Trump re-election campaign. We haven't had executions in 17 years, and suddenly we have 5 of them in less than 10 weeks, and we're about to have 2 more this week. When they set these execution dates originally a year ago, it was timed so that they would happen just at the beginning of the Democratic presidential primary process. Then they got stayed. That appeal was denied. Then they set the dates again in June. They announced them for July and August. And the August executions were during the Republican National Convention.
Bonowitz says until the precedent was shattered in July, capital punishment had all but stalled in the courts for 17 years. He adds that the Trump campaign emailed a fundraising pitch praising capital punishment just hours after the execution of Daniel Lee by lethal injection on July 14th. Bonowitz led a group of about a dozen activists to demonstrate in front of both Congress and the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. That group was joined by Democratic Representative Adriano Espaillat of New York, who introduced legislation last year to repeal the death penalty. He called the persistence of the practice an international embarrassment. Most countries around the world have stopped using capital punishment, including all members of the European Union, Mexico, and all nations in South America. Of the 20-some nations to still use the death penalty, the U.S. ranked 7th in most executed in 2018 by Amnesty International. A May Gallup poll found a record low percentage of Americans approved of the death penalty as morally acceptable. I'm Chris Lee, reporting for KPFA.
Still room for some of you to join the 20 people we are asking to make a financial donation tonight to keep the evening news on the air, to keep KPFA on the air. 1-800-439-5732 or kpfa.org. Just 5 minutes to go. 1-800-439-5732 or kpfa.org. This week, California Superintendent of Public Instruction Tony Thurmond announced new plans to help state schools combat bigotry, racism, and hate on their campuses. KPFA's Daniel Whitty reports.
The new measures will bring together teachers and community anti-racism activists to discuss ways to discuss bias and intolerance in the classroom. Thurmond said the state will use grants to fund these efforts.
Often people want to help, but they're not sure how to do it. And we have to have training and support. And I'm so honored that today we'll hear from the S.D. Bechtel Jr. Foundation to talk about some resources that they've made available for our efforts around addressing implicit bias in school.
Thurmond says the coronavirus has contributed to the re-emergence of anti-Asian xenophobia in schools and in society at large. He said education is the key to tackling negative stereotypes. Rick Zieber is a clinical social worker with Equality California. It's a statewide LGBT civil rights organization. He said plenty of LGBT students feel unsafe at school.
Too often, our LGBTQ youths face rejection at home or in their communities, especially now with so many students doing distance learning at home and bullying and harassment in our schools. According to a report by the Human Rights Campaign, just 32% of LGBTQ plus youth in California reported always feeling safe in the classroom. Half of LGBTQ plus students said they were teased or bullied because of their sexual orientation or gender identity, and more than a quarter said they were threatened with physical violence at least once.
Zieber said investing in anti-bias training now will save money for the state down the road because fewer social services will be needed. California State Senator Scott Wiener said LGBT students can face bullying from multiple sources at school.
Not just by kids, but unfortunately sometimes by teachers and staff. Not a majority, but some. And we need to make sure that our LGBTQ youth are uplifted and are told that they have value and that they have a future.
Superintendent Thurmond is introducing two programs. One is a mini grant for a staff development program. The program will award $200,000 in grants to local districts. In addition, there will be a virtual classroom series throughout October on the ways that schools can lead the way in ending discrimination and bias. Supporters of the initiative are urging Governor Gavin Newsom to declare racism a public health crisis. For KPFA News, I'm Daniel Whitty.
United Nations is marking its 75th anniversary. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres urged a multilateral, unified approach as he laid out a list of the world's problems.
25 years since the Beijing Platform for Action, gender inequality remains the greatest single challenge to human rights around the world. Climate calamity looms. Biodiversity is collapsing. Poverty is again rising. Hatred is spreading. Geopolitical tensions are escalating, and nuclear weapons remain on hair-trigger alert. Transformative technologies have opened up new opportunities, but also exposed new threats. And the COVID-19 pandemic has laid bare the world's fragilities. We can only address them together.
UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Mostly sunny tomorrow in the San Francisco Bay Area with highs in the low 70s. Further inland, sunny all day with highs in the mid-80s. Sunny in the central San Joaquin Valley tomorrow with highs in the low 90s. Sunny in Los Angeles with highs in the mid-80s.
Tune in Tuesday nights starting at 7 p.m. with La Raza Chronicles, a weekly Latinx Affairs magazine program with local and international focus, highlighting the social, political, and cultural events affecting the Latinx community. After that, it's international jazz, Latin jazz, and more on bebop, kubop, and the musical Truth with Avacha. At 10 p.m., it's the Reggae Express with Spliff Skankin and Tony Moses. That's Tuesday nights on 94.1 FM KPFA and kpfa.org.
You're listening to 94.1 KPFA, 89.3 KPFB in Berkeley, 88.1 KFCF in Fresno, 97.5 K24 8BR in Santa Cruz, and online worldwide at kpfa.org.
Just past the top of the hour here.